Our next speaker I am going to bring in for us. We have joining us Justin Grubb, and Justin is a filmmaker, photographer, a published writer, a naturalist, and a co-founder of Running Wild Media. With all of his years of international wildlife field research and formal and informal teaching experiences, Justin has combined those two different fields with media to enhance science communication. Justin's love for nature and passion for the outdoors has brought him to some of the most extreme habitats on Earth to film some critically endangered wildlife. He is a 2017 Emerging Wildlife Conservation Leader and a Nat Geo Wild to Inspire award-winning filmmaker, as well as a member of the Explorers Club. Justin, we're so excited to have you with us here today and can't wait to hear more about what you're up to these days.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to be here and share with you guys a really cool project that I've been working on.
Wonderful. And do you have a screen to share with us?
I do, yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
We can pull that up and get that in here for us.
Perfect.
All right. We'll add that in. And I will let you take it away.
Cool. I appreciate it. All right. So, like you said, my name is Justin. And on this presentation, I'm going to be talking about preserving biodiversity through village-led partnerships. It's a really cool concept that we have done with Planet Indonesia, and that I'm going to kind of share with you guys. But first, I want you guys to do a really quick little thing for me. I want you to either close your eyes and listen or stare at this tree and listen. But the important thing is to use your ears. You've probably seen a lot of photos today of biodiversity or videos, but I want you to just kind of stop and focus on the noise of biodiversity, what biodiversity actually sounds like. So we're going to be quiet for a little bit and we're going to listen to what biodiversity sounds like. So that is what a packed rainforest in the heart of Borneo sounds like. There's all kinds of really cool wildlife and noises that you hear. And you could hear helmeted hornbills. That was the laughing, cackling at the end, the whoop, 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 whoop. That is one of the coolest noises you could hear coming out of Borneo. You could also hear rhino hornbills. You could hear gibbons. You can hear insects. That is the noise of biodiversity, and that is the sound of a really healthy primary forest inside Borneo. So as we go through the presentation, I want you to kind of think about what that sounded like and reflect on what species you heard and what other animals you think you heard in that noise. But quickly, just quick about me so you can kind of get an idea of my background and where I'm coming from. Like it was mentioned before, I am a filmmaker and a photographer. I'm an explorer. I graduated from Bowling Green State University, which is in Ohio, and I got my Bachelor's of Science in Biology. And I'm currently earning my my Master's in Biology through Miami University. But for this presentation, I'm putting on my my Planet Indonesia hat. I'm actually the International Communications and Outreach Officer for Planet Indonesia. And Planet Indonesia is a really cool organization that is based in Borneo, and they work with a lot of really nice people to preserve biodiversity. So where is Indonesia? Well, if you look at the map there at the top left, it kind of shows the world, and then this little square shows where Indonesia is, and everything that's green is Indonesia. The darker spots are other islands, other countries. So when I'm talking about Indonesia and the areas that we work in, we primarily work here in Borneo, but it includes the entire country of Indonesia. So Bornean biodiversity, here's images of some of the coolest animals that I think exists in Borneo, which is where we work as Planet Indonesia. And we'll talk a lot more about Planet Indonesia in just a bit. We've got orangutans. The Bornean orangutan lives in Borneo. It's the largest population of orangutans in Indonesia. There's 3 species, the Bornean orangutan being one of them. We've got proboscis monkeys. You probably have heard of these guys. They've got big schnozzes on their faces. They got big bellies, and they love to eat mangrove leaves. Tons of insects, tons of snakes. There are about 1,500 different species of birds. There are almost 600 different species of mammals found in Indonesia, thousands and thousands of species of flowering plants, lots of different funguses. There's so much diversity in this area. And that's because Borneo in Indonesia sits right on the equator. And I'm sure you guys have learned today that that's where you find a lot of biodiversity, because the climate there is extremely stable and allows for all of these cool species to sort of evolve and fill all these very specialized niches in the environment, because the environment is very consistent. I do want to point out before we move on, this species right here, the helmeted hornbill, one of the coolest birds I think I've ever seen in the world. The males have big solid casques on their head, and they like to headbutt each other. And they do that for territorial disputes and for breeding purposes. So they're a really, really cool bird, one that Planet Indonesia really works well with, protecting this animal from the wild. We're in the wild. Another thing I wanted to point out is humans. Humans are part of biodiversity. So when you look at an ecosystem, you also want to think about the humans who live in that ecosystem and their relationship with all the different animals in the environment. So you have your food web, but don't forget to also include humans in on that food web. So these are some of the biodiversity challenges in Indonesia. It's fairly similar to those challenges all around the world. There's habitat loss. That usually comes along with development or agriculture, where there's a lot of people or there's cities. You have to make room for houses and buildings and agriculture and stuff. And so in order to do that, you have to remove a lot of the habitat that was there before, or that's how it's been historically done. Moving forward in the future, I don't believe it needs to be that way, but that's how it's been over the last several decades, or a couple hundred years. So habitat loss acts to fragment biodiversity and cause these animals, their populations, to decline. Another thing is pollution. There's a lot of plastic entering the oceans around the world, especially in Indonesia. There's a lot of garbage that's being tossed out. So the pollution, definitely affects the species out there in Borneo and affects the biodiversity. Overexploitation, that is a big one. Overexploitation being using some natural resources or wildlife resources to the point where it depletes these resources and they can no longer be used. So an example would be trees. Overexploiting trees is, cutting them down for use to build buildings or use the logs for whatever decorations or building tools. Another example would be going out and catching too many fish off of the Indonesian reefs so that they could go in the pet trade and be sold at aquarium stores. Another example of overexploitation would be hunting, going out into a forest and taking out too many animals to where their population has been depleted. Climate change obviously is a big one. One of the things that is really affecting these habitats all around the world is, since they've existed in such a very specific temperature range, climate range, having that climate change changes the dynamic of those forests, which cause a lot of those species that have become extremely specialized to not be able to handle the change in the environment. An example of that would be the cloud forests in Indonesia. They have existed at a certain altitude, at a certain temperature for so long, but as the temperature rises, the cloud forests actually recede or go up in altitude, and that habitat shrinks. And so the animals that live in those cloud forest habitat don't have as much habitat to use and are in higher competition with one another. Alien species, those are animals from around the world that come into a new environment, whether they're introduced by people or whether they are, usually brought there by accident, these species often prevent other species from, doing their life cycles, and they compete with one another and cause their populations to decline. The last thing I want to mention is economic and political tension. This can put a lot of pressure on the environment, and we'll explain a little bit about that later. But when there's people in need, they often have to go to the environment to meet their needs, and that puts a lot of pressure on biodiversity. So some really cool facts about Indonesia. Is one of the 17 mega diverse countries in the world. It contains 10% of the world's flowering species, and second behind Brazil in number of mammal species that exists within the country, which is crazy because Brazil is huge and Indonesia is broken up into 17,000 islands. So a lot of little areas for these mammals to live, but not as big as Brazil. So the human challenges in Indonesia, which kind of are the reason why a lot of the biodiversity there is threatened, is there are 40 million Indonesians who rely directly on biodiversity for their livelihoods. And so that means that they rely on animals and plant species to feed their families, to build their homes, to make money. And so 40 million people is a lot. That's about the population of California, all relying on essentially the wilderness to survive. And so a lot of these people have lack of access to basic goods and services, which means they can't get to a hospital if they're sick. They can't easily find food. They can't just go to the grocery store and get food. And so what they have to do is they have to go out and they have to catch their food. They have to go fish for their food. They have to go cultivate their food. In order to do that, it does put a lot of pressure on the biodiversity. Another thing is the socioeconomic inequalities that exist in not just Indonesia, but all around the world. That means that these people don't have access to basic services. They don't have access to a fair income. They don't have access to education. And so that can cause a lot of tension between biodiversity and their livelihoods. But that is a really good place where Planet Indonesia steps in. It really kind of helps the people who live in that area and helps preserve the biodiversity in that area by taking care of the people. And so Planet Indonesia is an organization. It's a grassroots organization that's based in Indonesia. And they work primarily with Indonesian people who live in communities in rural areas that live near areas of high biodiversity. So there's a couple project sites in Borneo that Planet Indonesia works with, and it's everything from the marine environment to the terrestrial environment. So they're working with bottom of the ocean all the way to the top of the mountain, and they're working with communities and villages and everybody everywhere in between. And so by doing this holistic approach to protecting biodiversity, we're having a lot of success in seeing the reduction of some of these exploitation, pollution, and deforestation events that you would have seen prior. And so it's a very solutions-focused program where, Planet Indonesia will go in and they will first listen to communities to see what they need, what kind of services that they need in order to do their thing. And then they will work with individual communities to kind of create these programs and services that the communities actually need. And by doing so, help alleviate some of that pressure off of the wilderness and the forests around them. And that in turn preserves biodiversity. So creating the enabling conditions for these partner communities to where they can be empowered to govern their own natural resources and be in charge of their own conservation and stuff like that. So an issue that conservation has seen in the past where a lot of organizations come from other countries and send people who don't really understand the issues, the challenges, and the things that the people need who live in these areas that these other organizations are trying to come and help conserve. And so that creates a lot of tension between an organization that doesn't necessarily know what's going on, telling another organization what to do and how to conserve their species. Well, the great thing about Planet Indonesia is it plays more of a supportive role, where it enables these communities through education and training and other support structures, economic support structures, so that these communities are actually in charge. They're the ones who are doing the conservation. So they live within areas of high biodiversity, they live in at-risk ecosystems, and they're the ones doing the biodiversity preservation, the conservation. So it puts them at the forefront, in the front lines of conservation. It makes them the champions of conservation. And these are just people who are going about their daily lives, doing whatever that makes them happy, but they're the ones who are being the conservation champions. And that's what's really cool about this program. And so the various programs that Planet Indonesia has there's a long list of them, and there's more. I'm not going to go through all of them because that's a lot to go through, but I will touch on some of the really important ones and how they work, so that when you're thinking about how to go about a conservation project in your own backyard or in your own community, or if you're trying to preserve biodiversity, think about these in the back of your mind. And this maybe stuff that would be helpful to you to really focus and hone in on what the community needs in working with the people that are around you, because conservation really is a human issue. It's not a wildlife issue. You got to work with people. It's all about people. And so making people happy is a great way to conserve wildlife and to get things that you want to get done. So I think one of the best programs that Planet Indonesia has, and one of the most holistic programs, is the Conservation Cooperative. And so what this program does is it allows community members to voice what challenges they're experiencing, and it allows them to tell Planet Indonesia what services they would like. And so with that, Planet Indonesia enters a little contract with them and starts providing a lot of services that the community needs. Things like healthcare or education programs or community loan programs, where community members will receive business training from Planet Indonesia to do new sustainable exploits, such as sustainable farming or organic fertilizer or stingless bee cultivation. And they'll receive the training to do so, and then they can receive business loans to be able to build the infrastructure for them to be able to start doing that. Or they'll receive a business loan to receive more business training that they need, or more resources that they possibly would need to do that. And so all the training that they receive does revolve around some sort of a sustainable business, so that they have the ability to create a more resilient livelihood, so that they are a little bit more resilient against economic or natural disasters or anything like that. If they have a solid business plan, a solid livelihood, then they'll be able to rely on that versus going out and needing to rely on the biodiversity. So that 40 million, this is all about reducing that 40 million so that more people have a sustainable, organic, holistic livelihood that they can fall back on in order to protect the species. So Healthy Communities is one of those programs. They go in and they help people who need access to hospitals. They'll provide training. Planet Indonesia will provide training for local ambassadors within the community so that they can provide basic health services so that the people living in those areas are feeling a little bit better. Another thing they do is fisheries management programs, where the communities will actually manage their own fishery. So they have temporary fishing closures to where they allow whatever they're fishing for, typically mud crab. Mud crabs live in mangrove ecosystems, and they're a really delicious food source for the people who live there. So being able to do temporary closures on those mud crabs, so where they have the ability to reproduce, so that when the fishing is open, there's a lot more crabs available, but that in turn helps the other animals that rely on those crabs and those fish for survival. And those animals do well, and they contribute to the mangrove ecosystem, which definitely always relates back to humans. So, healthy communities, if people are healthy, people are happy, the wildlife should be happy. Education and literacy programs, I mentioned before. mangrove restoration, agroforestry, that kind of goes in with those conservation cooperatives where by planting some agricultural products, they're actually contributing to restoring a lot of the rainforest and the habitat in the area that is then usable for those species that are rare and endangered. But in addition to all of that, Planet Indonesia does a lot of scientific research. One of that being the biodiversity teams. So Planet Indonesia has biodiversity teams that go out and they study the wildlife. They set trail cameras. They do audio transects. So they listen for the animals, just like you guys listened to at the beginning of this presentation, to determine what species are present and what species are absent. And they'll use that data and they'll analyze it and they'll compare it to the data of the human side of it. So they have metrics and a baseline to understand, what programs are being implemented in what areas and how has that impacted the biodiversity in that area. And what we were finding is some really cool stuff. And I'll get to that in a second. But another really cool program is the Smart Patrol program. It's spatial monitoring, assessment, and reporting tool, which allows rangers to go out into the forests and these project sites with GPS units and cameras and data sheets and use mapping technology to really understand where the animals are and where the pressures are. So they're, making note of illegal activity, anywhere that people are taking resources that they shouldn't be, so that they can better implement the rules of the protected areas that all of our project sites are associated with. And with these two programs, the villages that Planet Indonesia supports and partners with are the ones leading these programs. So the people who live within these protected areas are also the people who are leading these biodiversity surveys and who are leading these smart patrols and are enforcing the rules and regulations of these protected areas to make sure that the wildlife is safe, because they know healthy wildlife populations, healthy forests also equal healthy communities and healthy human lives. So last program I'm going to talk about, like I said, there's more, but we got to get through this quickly. One of them is really cool. It's Wakatak. It's the ex situ conservation program where they're working with species outside of their native natural areas. They work with animals that have been taken out of the forest. An example of that are songbirds. So a lot of the songbirds are taken from the forest, and that goes along with the overexploitation that I mentioned earlier is the issue to biodiversity in Indonesia. These birds are taken out and they're sold in markets all across different cities. They're sent to Jakarta, which is the capital. And so a lot of people buy these birds and keep them in cages their whole life. Well, this organization, the Wakatak program, addresses that. So they address illegal wildlife trade. And what they'll do is market surveys. They'll collect data on the animals being taken out of the wild and put into these illegal wildlife situations. But they'll also confiscate the animals, bring them back into the forest, because Planet Indonesia is building Indonesia's first animal rehabilitation center where the animals will be taken from the illegal wildlife trade, rehabilitated, acclimated, and then released back into the forest. And so this is a really neat idea that will take animals, put them back in the forest so they can continue contributing to the ecosystem. And so over the last 6 years, Planet Indonesia has seen a lot of really positive changes. So a significant decrease in deforestation. Like I mentioned, a lot of these communities are reliant upon biodiversity, and in times of need, they have to go out and they have to cut down trees, they've got to take animals. But when they're part of these Planet Indonesia programs, they no longer really have to do that as much as they did. So we're seeing a 77% decrease in the amount of deforestation that we had seen historically in our project sites. And since we do biodiversity surveys and really study the animals along these areas, we're seeing a major rebound in wildlife populations along these sites. And I can anecdotally attest to that. When I went out to one of the project sites, Gunung Niu, about 3 years ago, we had just started a Smart Patrol program there. And when I went into the forest, it was really kind of quiet. I didn't hear the noises that you heard at the beginning of the presentation. All I heard were insects. And that's because the birds and the mammals and those animals were taken out of the ecosystem because of hunting and so forth. And so I went back again after the program has been active for quite a while, and was able to start hearing rhinoceros hornbills again and helmeted hornbills again. And I saw a couple monkeys in there as well. And so the noises were coming back, and that is all a result of the presence of the villages, the smart patrols that these villages have going on. The fisheries are stable now. Before, there were long periods of time where it was hard to find mud crabs. Now, because of the temporary closing of the fisheries, they're able to get a lot of really good harvests throughout the year. And we have over 59 partner villages now, all a part of these conservation cooperatives and receiving programs and services from Planet Indonesia. And we're growing at a very, very fast rate. We just had a map come out where it showed our exponential growth of the conservation cooperative model. Over the last couple months, we've added a bunch of villages to our programming, and we're really excited about what this year is going to bring and what the next couple years are going to bring. We're going to keep adding partner villages to create these resilient livelihoods so that they can have more food security, economic security, all part of these programs. And so all in all, we have over 170,000 individuals who all benefit in some way from these conservation cooperatives and these services that Planet Indonesia implements in the community. And so with all that being said, I think the important thing to walk away with in this presentation is that communities and people and locals are the answer to preserving biodiversity, protecting biodiversity, and really turning around the massive biodiversity loss that we've been experiencing over the last several decades. It's really working with people, making sure that their needs are met, and that's how you address the root issue, the root causes of biodiversity loss all around the world. So when you're thinking about ways to solve whatever issue you want, if you want to implement a conservation program in your area, or if you're a young budding conservationist and you want to save a particular animal in your backyard, really it comes down to working with people, getting people to understand what the issue is, how to protect it, but also supporting those people's needs and making sure that they're happy so that then you can protect the wildlife. And so we want to hear from you. We want to connect. So if you guys have any questions or if you have anything you want to say, please check us out. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. The website is planetindonesia.org. We're on Twitter. You can contact planetindonesia.org. There's an email there, but you can also Facebook message, Instagram. It actually goes to me. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask on those platforms, and we would be more than happy to connect, give advice, and entertain your comments. And so with that,
thank you so much, Justin. That was absolutely fantastic, and so wonderful and inspiring to hear. We have something that just came in on the chat that said, very encouraging. Please keep these efforts going on. So thank you so much for all of that wonderful work that you all are doing at Planet Indonesia. And it's so impressive to see in the 6 years the impact that you've already had is absolutely amazing. So definitely worth celebrating indeed.
Absolutely. And we're excited to be adding new project sites here in the future. So keep your eyes open for news and all kinds of exciting stuff that we're working on. But I mean, this model could be implemented anywhere in the world and have just as much success as we have. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here and sharing all of your work.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me. And this is such a unique idea and a cool program. I'm excited to be a part of it.
Absolutely. All right. Have a great night, Justin.
All right. Thank you.